The Boeing 727 was a standard domestic flight, departing from Portland, Oregon on November 24, 1971. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and for the 36 passengers aboard Flight 305, it was just another routine journey. As the plane ascended toward cruising altitude, few could have imagined that in a few hours their world would be forever altered. On board, a man sat quietly in the rear of the plane, a nondescript figure among the crowd. His appearance was average, mid-40s, neatly dressed in a dark suit, a tie, and black shoes. He looked like any other businessman returning home from a conference, a face easily forgotten in a sea of transient travelers. But this man, whom the world would come to know as D.B. Cooper, was about to carry out one of the most audacious heists in modern history. At 2:50 p.m., while the plane cruised at an altitude of 10,000 feet, Cooper signaled to a flight attendant, a young woman named Florence Schaffner. Calmly, he handed her a note. At first, Schaffner assumed it was just another casual passenger requesting a drink or a service, but as she unfolded the paper, her heart skipped a beat. The note read, "I have a bomb. I want $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle. If my demands are not met, I will blow up the plane." Schaffner's mind raced. This was no ordinary note. This was a hijacking. She glanced over at the man who had handed it to her. Cooper was staring out the window, seemingly unfazed by the tension he had just introduced into the cabin. His calmness was unsettling. For a moment, Schaffner hesitated, then returned to the front of the plane where she discreetly notified the flight crew. They quickly alerted the cockpit. The captain, William Scott, and the first officer, Bob Radist, were both shocked by the threat but did not immediately panic. They had to remain in control. Meanwhile, Cooper leaned back in his seat, his demeanor cool, almost casual. He didn't seem the least bit concerned about the growing anxiety around him. He appeared to be well prepared, as if he had done this before. Welcome to Beneath the Surface, the dark side of crime. In this series, we dive deep into the world of unsolved mysteries, notorious criminals, and stories that have baffled investigators for years. Prepare to uncover the truth behind some of the most chilling crimes in history. As we explore the shadows of the past, we invite you to question what you know as we journey into the unknown. Stay with us as we peel back the layers and uncover what lies beneath the surface. By 3 p.m., the flight was descending toward Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The hijacker had made a list of demands: $200,000 in unmarked bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck to be waiting on the runway. If his conditions were not met, he would detonate the bomb he had claimed to possess. The crew relayed the ransom demands to the authorities on the ground, and the FBI was immediately notified. By the time the plane was on approach to Seattle, a full-blown crisis had begun to unfold. Cooper's calmness continued to confound the crew. He remained seated in his place, sipping his drink and only occasionally communicating with the flight attendants. His demands were clear and specific, and he made no effort to engage in conversation beyond what was necessary. The authorities moved quickly. They began assembling the ransom money and preparing the parachutes. The airport ground crew was instructed to stay out of sight, and law enforcement scrambled to prepare for any possible scenario. Meanwhile, the plane circled above the airport, waiting for further instructions. Cooper was prepared to wait. Inside the plane, a quiet tension settled over the passengers. Some whispered nervously to one another, wondering what was happening. Others stared out the window, unable to shake the unease that had settled in the cabin. Few knew what had just transpired in the rear of the plane, where Cooper sat, the calm architect of their situation. Flight attendants moved swiftly and silently down the aisles, trying to keep the passengers calm without giving away any hint of the danger they were in. One of them, a young woman named Tina Mucklow, was instructed to go back to Cooper and ensure his demands were being met. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, Cooper looked up at her and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Everything is fine," he said quietly. Just take care of the details." His tone was polite, as if they were engaged in a casual conversation. There was no anger, no harsh words, only the calm voice of a man in control. Tina felt a wave of unease, but she nodded and turned to leave. As she did, she noticed something odd. There were no signs of panic or urgency in Cooper's actions. He wasn't nervous or erratic like most hijackers were portrayed in the media. He was methodical, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed every step of this moment long before it happened. The minutes ticked by, and the flight was held in a holding pattern above the airport. The FBI, now fully engaged, began preparing for a ground operation. Meanwhile, on the plane, Cooper's demands were finally met. The money was packaged and delivered. The parachutes were brought on board, and the flight crew, along with the ground authorities, hoped to contain the situation before it escalated further. Cooper seemed satisfied. At 5:24 p.m., the Boeing 727 landed at Seattle-Tacoma, and Cooper's demands were met. The authorities now had to figure out how to handle the next phase of the hijacking. They knew Cooper had a plan, and the real fear was that they had no idea what it was. They had already begun working on a solution, but there was one part of his demand that still hadn't been addressed. How would he make his escape? The plane taxied to a remote part of the airport runway, where Cooper had requested that it stop. No one knew what he was planning, but the air was thick with uncertainty. As the final preparations were made, no one could predict the sheer audacity of Cooper's next move. The air inside the cabin of Flight 305 was thick with unease as the plane touched down on the runway at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. What had begun as a routine flight was now a full-fledged hijacking, and the passengers were all too aware of it. Yet, amid the uncertainty, one thing remained eerily clear. D.B. Cooper was in control. As the plane taxied toward a remote area of the airport, Cooper's demands were met. The ransom money, $200,000 in unmarked bills, was handed to the flight attendants, along with the parachutes he had requested. A fuel truck was waiting, ready to refuel the plane for its onward journey. In Cooper's mind, everything was proceeding as planned. On board, the crew was now working in silent coordination. Flight attendants Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner, along with the other flight crew members, were acutely aware of the stakes. They had been carefully trained in how to handle an emergency, but nothing in their training had prepared them for the precision and calmness with which Cooper was executing this hijacking. "Just keep your cool," Cooper had told the flight attendants. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, but there was an undercurrent of authority that left no room for disagreement. Once the money and parachutes were securely delivered, Cooper instructed the flight crew to prepare for the next phase of his plan. It was nearly 5:30 p.m., and the plane was stationary on the runway. The door was to remain closed. Cooper had been specific about that. The plane was still, and the tension within its walls grew as the seconds passed. The passengers were unaware of the specifics of the hijacking, but they could feel the anxiety in the air. Some had begun to whisper nervously, while others stared out the windows, waiting for some sign of what would happen next. Meanwhile, the FBI's emergency response team was in full motion. Helicopters circled above, watching the plane from a distance. On the ground, law enforcement agents were spread out, stationed at various points to maintain a secure perimeter. They had no idea what Cooper was planning, but they knew he would not make the next move without warning. As the minutes stretched on, Cooper remained in the rear of the plane, seemingly unconcerned. He had already provided the flight attendants with a list of additional instructions. He requested that the plane take off again, this time with the rear stairway door open. His intention was clear. Once the plane reached a suitable altitude, he would jump from the aircraft, vanishing into the night. But the FBI was ready, or so they thought. Their only goal was to keep the situation from spiraling further out of control, to preserve the lives of the hostages on board, and to get Cooper off the plane as quickly as possible. Back in the cockpit, Captain William Scott and First Officer Bob Radist were fully aware of the severity of their situation. They had followed Cooper's instructions, keeping him calm and cooperative, but they also knew that his next move could be deadly. As the plane taxied towards the runway, Scott and Radist exchanged glances, each man aware of the gravity of the moment. There had been no hint of panic from Cooper, no sign of instability. He had made his demands with clinical precision, and he had shown no signs of aggression toward the crew or passengers. He was a man with a plan, and there was no telling what lengths he would go to in order to escape. At approximately 5:45 p.m., Captain Scott received the final confirmation from the authorities that everything was in place. The ransom money was secured. The parachutes had been provided. The fuel truck was in position, ready to refuel the plane when Cooper's escape was imminent. Cooper, for his part, seemed relaxed. He remained seated in the rear of the plane, his body language betraying no tension. As the plane's engines roared back to life and the aircraft began to taxi once more, Cooper quietly adjusted his tie and gazed out the window as if he were on any ordinary flight. The plan was set in motion, and the plane once again began its ascent, this time climbing toward the clouds under very different circumstances. As the flight climbed to 10,000 feet, Cooper stood up from his seat, taking the duffel bag containing the ransom money with him. He walked slowly down the narrow aisle to the rear stairway, the flight attendants watching him closely. Tina Mucklow, who had been one of the primary points of contact with Cooper, nervously followed him as he moved toward the back of the plane. "I'll be fine," Cooper said, giving Mucklow a reassuring smile. He didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he seemed oddly calm. For a man who was about to commit a dangerous and unprecedented act, his demeanor was strikingly composed. Tina stood just outside the stairway door, peering in at Cooper as he began preparing to open the rear stairs. His quiet confidence unsettled her. She could hardly believe the situation she found herself in. The flight crew had done everything Cooper asked, and now they were watching as he prepared to make his exit. With the stairway now open, Cooper's escape was imminent. He strapped on the parachute, his hands steady despite the cold wind rushing through the doorway. The sky outside had darkened, and the plane flew through the clouds, its lights barely visible against the vast expanse of night. It was as if the world had gone still. Just a few moments remained before Cooper's leap into the unknown. In those final moments, it was clear that Cooper had thought of everything. He knew the aircraft's capabilities. He understood the weather conditions. He was a man who had planned this heist with military precision. The tension on the plane was palpable. The flight crew had no idea what would happen next, but they knew the stakes. They had cooperated, played their parts, and now they were helpless witnesses to the most daring hijacking in U.S. history. With a final glance around the cabin, Cooper disappeared into the night, vanishing without a trace. The rear stairway door clanged closed, the wind howling outside, and for the briefest moment the plane seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. It was over, or so they thought. Inside the plane, the crew exchanged tense glances. They couldn't yet fathom what had just occurred. Was Cooper really gone? Had he made it out safely, or had the jump been a fatal mistake? Captain Scott and First Officer Radist worked quickly, the cockpit a flurry of activity as they prepared to land the plane. But as they neared the airport, the realization set in. D.B. Cooper was not coming back, and they had no idea where he was. Theories about Cooper's identity began to circulate almost immediately after the hijacking. The man had been calm, composed, and methodical, suggesting that he was someone with experience, possibly a former military man or a skilled skydiver. His precise planning and ability to execute the hijacking without panic indicated a level of intelligence and organization that made him appear far from ordinary. In the weeks following the hijacking, a few suspects came to light, but none were proven to be Cooper. Some theorized that Cooper was a career criminal, someone who had planned the heist for months, perhaps even years. Others believed he was a former military man, someone with expertise in parachuting and the ability to pull off such an audacious act. One of the more popular theories was that Cooper was actually someone with knowledge of aircraft, perhaps a former airline worker or a mechanic who understood how to maneuver the plane and evade capture. However, none of these theories provided any solid evidence that could conclusively identify Cooper. The case was frustrating for law enforcement, as the hijacker had left no definitive trace. They had no fingerprints, no DNA, no solid leads, just a handful of witness descriptions and the physical evidence of the hijacking itself. Cooper had covered his tracks meticulously, ensuring that no one would ever be able to definitively prove who he was. The plane had just made its descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport when Captain William Scott received the confirmation from the crew in the back of the plane. Cooper had jumped. For the briefest moment, Scott felt a surge of relief, only to be immediately overwhelmed by the realization of the scale of what had just occurred. The calmness with which Cooper had executed the hijacking and the audacity of his escape were both unsettling and impressive. The question now was, had Cooper survived the jump? The flight crew, in stunned silence, began to discuss their next steps, but deep down, they knew there was no way of knowing what had happened to Cooper. They had followed his instructions, carefully, methodically, but nothing had prepared them for the aftermath. For the moment, the plane landed without incident. It taxied to a remote area of the runway, far from the terminals where law enforcement had been stationed to take control of the situation. As the plane came to a stop, the crew members remained seated, exchanging nervous glances. They had just witnessed history in the making. The hijacker was gone, but where had he gone? And was he even alive? On the ground, FBI Special Agent Frank Marsh, a seasoned investigator, had been in constant communication with Captain Scott and the flight crew. Marsh, a no-nonsense man with a reputation for solving even the most complex cases, knew this one would be different. He had been through many hijacking cases, but none as audacious as this. A man had boarded a commercial plane, stolen $200,000, and then parachuted out of the aircraft into the unknown. In Marsh's mind, the question wasn't whether the man was skilled, it was how skilled he was. And how had he known so much about planes, parachuting, and evading capture? As soon as the plane touched down, Agent Marsh, along with his partner, Detective Karen Fisher, boarded the aircraft. Fisher, a younger but highly determined investigator, had been with the FBI for 5 years and had already made a name for herself on a series of difficult cases. Fisher's face was taut with concern as she looked at the flight attendants, especially Tina Mucklow, who had spent the most time with Cooper during the flight. Mucklow was shaking, her usual calm demeanor completely shaken by the ordeal. Fisher approached her first. "Tina, are you okay?" Fisher asked softly, her voice filled with genuine concern. Mucklow nodded, but her voice wavered. "I don't know what just happened. One moment he was sitting there, calm as can be, and the next, he was gone." Fisher took notes as she listened carefully. The description of Cooper was becoming clearer. A man in his mid-40s wearing a dark suit and tie and possessing a quiet, composed manner that had allowed him to take complete control of the situation without ever seeming agitated. He had made his demands calmly and had known exactly what to ask for: $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by. Fisher glanced over at Agent Marsh, who was talking to Captain Scott. She could see the frustration on his face. Marsh was a man used to solving cases with facts. Yet here he was, staring at an empty plane, with no clues as to where Cooper had gone. The first and most pressing question: where was Cooper? The authorities had no idea where to start their search. Cooper had made a clean getaway, with no clear indication of where he had landed or where he might be headed. They could only assume he had parachuted into the thick woods of Washington State, a rugged and unforgiving terrain. Marsh and Fisher immediately set up a command center in one of the airport's offices. The FBI dispatched helicopters to search the skies for any sign of Cooper. Ground teams were sent out to comb through the forests and fields surrounding the plane's flight path. Meanwhile, Detective Fisher worked alongside local law enforcement to gather witness reports from those who had been aboard the plane. "I want every inch of that forest searched," Marsh said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to find him, or at least find something that leads us to him. I don't care if it takes days." Fisher nodded. "I'll get the search team started, Frank. But I've got a feeling this isn't going to be as easy as it looks." The FBI had hoped that Cooper's jump would leave behind some form of evidence. Perhaps a piece of his parachute would be found, or maybe Cooper would have been injured in the jump, leaving a trail for them to follow. But after days of searching, the authorities found nothing. As the hours turned to days, the FBI's initial optimism began to wane. Cooper's escape was clean, and the lack of any leads was beginning to take its toll. Detective Fisher was especially frustrated. "Every lead we've followed so far has been a dead end," Fisher said, pacing the small office. "We've got nothing to go on. No parachute, no Cooper, just a lot of empty forest and mountains." "I know," Marsh replied, leaning back in his chair. "But we can't give up yet. We've got to consider every possibility. Maybe Cooper wasn't just a random criminal. Maybe this was planned by someone with experience, someone who knew exactly what they were doing." Marsh's hunch was proven right when, several years later, the first real clue emerged. A package containing $5,800 in cash was discovered in 1980, buried along the Columbia River just north of Portland. The money, badly deteriorated and torn, still had visible serial numbers that matched those given to Cooper during the hijacking. Detective Fisher was the first to hear about the discovery. She immediately contacted Marsh. They both knew that this was significant, but it was far from enough to crack the case. "Frank, they found some of the ransom money," Fisher said when she called him. $5,800. What do you think?" "It's a sign he's still out there," Marsh replied, his voice laced with a renewed sense of urgency. "He's out there somewhere, and we need to find him." The discovery of the money only deepened the mystery. Had Cooper survived? Or had he simply tossed the money aside and disappeared into the wilderness? Was he still alive? Or had he died in the jump? As the investigation continued, the FBI received a flood of tips, each more outlandish than the last. Some speculated that Cooper was a disgruntled airline employee with extensive knowledge of planes. Others believed he was a former military man who had planned his escape meticulously. Fisher and Marsh worked tirelessly to follow up on every lead, but none proved to be Cooper. Despite the growing pool of suspects, they remained without answers. Fisher was particularly struck by one theory: that Cooper had been someone with expert knowledge of skydiving and had used his parachute skills to make a daring escape into the night. Could he have been a professional skydiver? Fisher asked Marsh one evening as they sat in their office reviewing the case files. It would explain how he knew exactly when to jump and how he could have pulled it off so smoothly. Marsh rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Possibly, but we've got no solid leads to confirm any of these theories. This guy planned his escape better than we ever thought possible." As time wore on, the FBI's frustration grew. The case was beginning to feel like an unsolvable riddle, with too many pieces missing and too few answers. In 2016, after years of investigation, the FBI closed the case, citing a lack of new leads and conclusive evidence. The decision was not without controversy. Many agents, including Fisher, believed they were just one step away from uncovering the truth. The mystery of D.B. Cooper, however, did not end there. The legend of the hijacker, whose heist had been flawless and whose identity remained elusive, became a national obsession. Fisher and Marsh were no longer involved in the case, but they both knew the mystery would live on forever. The Boeing 727 soared into the night sky over the Pacific Northwest, the dark clouds looming below as a gust of cold air rushed through the open stairway door. The plane, still in motion at 10,000 feet, rumbled as D.B. Cooper took his final steps down the narrow aisle, clutching the duffel bag filled with $200,000 in cash. The flight attendants, already on edge from the growing tension, watched him carefully as he moved toward the rear of the plane. Tina Mucklow, who had spent the most time with Cooper during the flight, couldn't shake the odd sense of calm that had surrounded him. "Good luck," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible above the sound of the plane's engines. Cooper didn't respond with words, but as his gaze met hers, Tina felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes were calm, calculating even, as if he were embarking on some mundane task. The expression on his face was unsettling. There was no sign of nervousness, no sign of panic. He seemed absolutely certain that this would work. With a final nod, Cooper reached the rear stairway and prepared to make his leap. Inside the cockpit, Captain William Scott and First Officer Bob Radist exchanged a brief but knowing glance. They had followed Cooper's instructions meticulously, but the moment was still surreal. This wasn't something they had been trained for. A hijacker had boarded their plane, executed a flawless heist, and now he was going to jump out of the aircraft with the ransom. Cooper's escape was imminent. There was no going back now. "Is he really going to do it?" Radist muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. Scott didn't respond immediately, but his hand rested on the control yoke as he focused on keeping the plane steady. He had done his job, but now he was just a witness to what could very well be a man's last act. "We can only hope he's prepared for it," Scott said grimly. "He knows what he's doing." But in truth, no one knew. Cooper was a complete enigma. His past, his motivations, and his ability to execute such a daring escape without any sign of nerves made him appear more like a criminal mastermind than a desperate hijacker. And yet, here he was, preparing to jump from a moving airplane at night into the unknown. In the rear of the plane, Cooper unstrapped his seatbelt and stood up, the cool draft of air tugging at his jacket. His movements were deliberate, measured, as if every second mattered. He had already donned a parachute, and with a quiet sigh, he swung the duffel bag of money onto his shoulder. Tina Mucklow, standing just a few feet away, tried to maintain her composure, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. "You've got this," she said softly, although she wasn't sure whether she was reassuring herself or him. Cooper turned toward her for a brief moment. "Just stay calm," he replied, his voice low but steady. His words carried an odd calmness, as if the entire situation, his hijacking, his escape, even his leap into the night, were all part of some preordained plan. And then, without another word, Cooper stepped forward to the rear stairway door. Tina stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't believe this was happening. No one had ever dared anything like this before. Cooper had hijacked a plane, stolen $200,000, and now he was going to jump out of it. She had no idea what was going through his mind. Was he prepared for the danger? Or had he miscalculated? As Cooper opened the rear stairway door, the cold rush of air battered the cabin, and the plane's altitude fluctuated as the pressure in the cabin adjusted. The noise was deafening as the door swung wide. Cooper, undeterred by the storm of wind, took a moment to glance back at Tina. His calm gaze was unshaken by the turbulence. Then, in one smooth motion, he stepped onto the stairway. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Cooper had planned this moment with chilling precision. He moved with the deliberate steps of a man who had done this many times before, though no one knew whether this was true or not. The cold, sharp night air greeted him as he began to descend the metal staircase that led to the darkness below. The sound of the wind was overwhelming, and the plane continued its flight through the night, unaware of whether Cooper would make it to the ground safely or become one of the countless missing persons swallowed by the wilderness. Inside the cockpit, Captain Scott's grip tightened on the yoke. "Hold steady, Bob," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We don't know where he's going or if he'll make it." First Officer Radist nodded silently, his mind racing. The only thing they knew for sure was that D.B. Cooper had jumped, and the plane was now a crime scene. Outside, Cooper's parachute opened with a sudden jolt. His body was yanked upward by the force of the opening chute. but he quickly adjusted, stabilizing his descent. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air, Cooper's figure silhouetted against the backdrop of dark clouds and distant lights. He was free, or so he thought. Inside the plane, the crew could only watch helplessly as Cooper's form disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but the deafening sound of the wind and the cold, empty stairway door behind him. Tina Mucklow, who had been watching from the rear of the cabin, felt a strange combination of disbelief and relief. It was over, at least for her. She had done her part. She had cooperated with Cooper's demands without ever truly understanding the danger she was in. And now, the man who had threatened her life and held everyone aboard hostage was gone. As the plane continued its flight path, the crew began their preparations for landing. The initial shock was wearing off, but the unease remained. Captain Scott knew that he and his team would be under scrutiny when they touched down. There would be questions, so many questions about how a man had hijacked their plane, how he had executed the perfect heist, and how he had escaped without leaving a trace. Back on the ground, Agent Frank Marsh was already at the airport's operations center, coordinating the search for Cooper. The helicopters were in the air, their searchlights scanning the forest below. Fisher stood beside him, her face set in determination. "Where is he?" Marsh muttered, staring at the dark expanse of wilderness stretching out beneath them. How could he have vanished like this? Fisher was equally stunned. It's like he planned every step of this. He knew exactly what to do, how to evade us. We may never find him. Marsh paused, his mind racing. Cooper had made it off the plane, but where did he go next? The search was already underway, but the chances of finding him in the dense forests of Washington were slim. The idea that Cooper might have survived his leap into the wilds of the Pacific Northwest seemed impossible. The terrain was rugged, unforgiving, and the weather conditions that night had been far from ideal. But somehow, Cooper had pulled it off. The Boeing 727 had safely touched down on the runway at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, but the feeling of relief was short-lived. The crew was still reeling from the shock of the hijacking, but their job wasn't over yet. In the minutes following the plane's arrival, the cockpit crew, led by Captain William Scott, secured the aircraft and the remaining flight attendants began evacuating the shaken passengers. Agent Frank Marsh stood on the tarmac, his arms crossed as he watched the plane. The chaos was only beginning. Within moments, FBI agents and law enforcement officers swarmed the area, preparing to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and piece together the mystery of D.B. Cooper's heist. "Where the hell did he go?" Marsh muttered under his breath as he surveyed the surrounding forest. Cooper had jumped from the rear stairway door of the plane, but where had he gone? Was he lying low somewhere nearby, or had he disappeared into the vast wilderness? Marsh's partner, Detective Karen Fisher, approached him with a serious expression on her face. "We've got to act fast, Frank," Fisher said, her voice steady but tense. "If he's still alive, he's out there somewhere. We need to cover every inch of ground." Marsh nodded. "We've already got helicopters out. Ground teams are being set up, but Cooper could have landed anywhere. This isn't going to be easy." The first priority was to search the area around the flight path, specifically the dense forests of Washington. Helicopters with floodlights buzzed above, scouring the trees for any sign of Cooper, but the terrain was rough and visibility was poor. The jump had happened at night, and Cooper had landed somewhere in the thick underbrush of the Cascade Range. Fisher worked closely with local law enforcement, coordinating the search efforts. They set up checkpoints along possible exit routes, hoping to find a sign of Cooper's escape, anything that could lead them to him. But despite the hours of searching, no traces of the elusive hijacker were found. No parachute, no Cooper, not even footprints. "Nothing," Fisher said to Marsh over the radio, frustration clear in her tone. "There's no sign of him anywhere. We've covered every square inch." "Keep looking," Marsh replied, though even he felt the growing sense of doubt. He has to be out there. He couldn't have vanished without a trace. The days after the hijacking blurred together as the search expanded, but each new day brought no new leads. By the time the initial search operation was called off, the authorities had no choice but to face the grim reality. D.B. Cooper had managed to escape. But the case was far from over. The FBI immediately launched a formal investigation into the hijacking itself. Cooper had executed a daring heist with frightening precision. The authorities knew that to understand how he had pulled off such a feat, they would need to piece together his movements and motivations. Marsh and Fisher were assigned to investigate every aspect of the hijacking, from Cooper's initial contact with the flight attendants to his precise escape from the plane. The first step was interviewing the crew and passengers. The flight attendants, especially Tina Mucklow, were shaken but cooperative. They described Cooper as calm, almost eerily so. Mucklow recalled how he had handed her the note demanding the ransom, how he had spoken to her with an unsettling assurance. "He was so calm about it," Mucklow said, recalling the moment Cooper first revealed his demands. "Like it was just another business transaction. He didn't seem scared at all. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing." The other flight attendants and crew members offered similar descriptions. Cooper had been polite, composed, and in complete control of the situation. His demands for $200,000, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck were specific and clear, leaving no room for error. And when it came time to jump, Cooper had made his exit without hesitation, disappearing into the night. As the investigation ramped up, the FBI began analyzing the evidence collected from the plane. The serial numbers on the ransom money, the parachutes, and even Cooper's personal effects were all carefully cataloged. There were few fingerprints to work with, and none that could definitively link Cooper to the crime. His identity remained a mystery. Fisher worked long hours, sorting through potential suspects and trying to figure out if Cooper had any connection to the airline or if he had any background in parachuting or aviation. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the man's knowledge of aircraft systems. How had he known the plane's specific flight path, the position of the rear stairway door, and the best way to escape undetected? "We're dealing with someone who knows planes," Fisher remarked one night as she reviewed flight logs. "He must have had some inside knowledge. Either that, or he had experience with aviation and parachuting." Agent Marsh, ever the pragmatist, was more focused on finding concrete leads. "You're right," he said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "But we need to figure out who this guy really is. We can't just sit around speculating. We need suspects, witnesses, and evidence. We need a breakthrough." Months passed, and the investigation grew more complex. The FBI expanded its search to include a network of informants, re-examined old criminal databases, and even interviewed former military personnel trying to uncover any possible links to Cooper's escape. But the more they dug, the less they found. There were no obvious leads, no clear pattern, and no suspects who seemed to match Cooper's description. Fisher and Marsh began to face the harsh reality. D.B. Cooper had executed the perfect heist. There were no fingerprints, no solid evidence, and no trace of him left behind. He had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, and no one could figure out how. Then, in 1980, nearly a decade after the hijacking, a discovery was made that would spark renewed interest in the case. A young boy playing near the Columbia River in Washington stumbled upon a decaying bundle of cash, $5,800 of the ransom money that had been handed to Cooper. The bills were in rough condition, faded and torn, but the serial numbers matched those of the ransom money given to Cooper on the day of the hijacking. Detective Fisher, who had since been promoted to special agent, was one of the first to hear about the discovery. She immediately contacted Marsh, who was now overseeing several high-profile investigations across the country. "This could be it, Frank," Fisher said on the phone. "We've got $5,800 of the ransom money. It's linked directly to Cooper. He didn't just disappear. He's out there, and we need to find him." But even with the discovery of the money, the mystery surrounding D.B. Cooper remained unsolved. The find was puzzling. Why would Cooper leave behind some of the money, especially after executing a plan so meticulously? Theories ranged from him hiding the money in case he needed it later to him discarding it after some unforeseen complication. For the FBI, it only deepened the mystery of Cooper's fate. With no new evidence to pursue, the FBI officially closed the case in 2016. Yet, despite the official closure, the fascination with D.B. Cooper's story never truly faded. New theories emerged, and countless individuals claimed to have discovered Cooper's true identity, but none were proven. As time passed, the case became more than just an unsolved crime. It became a part of American folklore. The legend of D.B. Cooper endured, an enduring mystery that captivated the imagination of millions. The FBI's investigation into D.B. Cooper's daring hijacking and subsequent disappearance had reached a critical juncture. The discovery of the $5,800 in ransom money near the Columbia River in 1980 had ignited a new wave of hope. The cash had been found by a young boy playing near the water, a discovery that seemed too coincidental to ignore. The bills were deteriorated, but the serial numbers matched those of the ransom money that Cooper had taken from the plane nearly a decade earlier. For the first time in years, the FBI had a tangible connection to the case. But what did it mean? Special Agent Karen Fisher stood in front of a large map of the Pacific Northwest in the FBI's office, staring at the marked coordinates where the money had been discovered. Her mind raced as she considered the possibilities. Why would Cooper have left behind a portion of the ransom money? Was it an oversight, or had he intentionally discarded it? "It doesn't make sense," Fisher muttered to herself, tapping her finger against the map. "He had it all planned out. So why leave it behind?" Her partner, Agent Frank Marsh, entered the room, holding a stack of files. His expression was unreadable, but Fisher could tell he was feeling the same frustration. "We need to focus on what we know," Marsh said, dropping the files onto the table. "The discovery of the money is important, but it's not enough to solve this case. We've got to go back to the basics. What do we have, and who do we know?" Fisher nodded, turning her attention to the evidence board where they had pinned all the clues from the case. Witness statements, flight records, witness sketches of Cooper, and the serial numbers of the ransom money. The board was filled with theories, but none of them had led to anything concrete. Over the years, the investigation had taken on a life of its own. Numerous false leads had cropped up, each one adding to the mystery and frustration surrounding the case. From the moment Cooper had jumped from the plane, people had come forward with theories, tips, and wild speculations about his identity. Every new theory seemed more outlandish than the last, but none of them had led to a breakthrough. One of the most persistent theories involved a man named Richard McCoy, a former military man who had pulled off a similar hijacking just a few years after Cooper's. McCoy had hijacked a plane, demanded a ransom, and then parachuted out of the plane, just like Cooper. The similarities were striking, and many believed McCoy could be the elusive hijacker. But when McCoy was arrested for a different crime in 1972, the theory began to fall apart. Although he resembled the description of Cooper in some ways, there was no evidence linking him to the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Fisher and Marsh had looked into McCoy's background extensively. He was an experienced parachutist, and the similarities between his hijacking and Cooper's were undeniable. But when investigators found no solid connection between McCoy and the D.B. Cooper case, they were forced to abandon the theory. Another theory revolved around a man named Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest Orient Airlines employee. Christensen was said to have matched the physical description of Cooper, and he had worked for the airline at the time of the hijacking. In 2003, an investigation into Christensen's past, based on a book by author Thomas Colbert, suggested that Christensen might have been Cooper. The evidence seemed compelling at first. There were accounts of his mysterious behavior and his possible knowledge of the airline's inner workings. But when the FBI investigated further, they found no direct evidence linking Christensen to the hijacking, and the theory eventually fell flat. Then there was the theory that Cooper might have been a disgruntled former airline employee with detailed knowledge of the plane's mechanics. Some even speculated that Cooper had been a mechanic himself, someone who understood the layout of the aircraft and how to bypass its security systems. It was possible, even likely, that the hijacker had some knowledge of planes. After all, he knew exactly where to find the rear stairway, a feature that wasn't common on all aircraft at the time. But again, despite numerous interviews with former employees and mechanics, the theory was never proven. Despite these dead ends, the investigation continued. Fisher and Marsh combed through every lead, every theory, hoping to find a thread that would unravel the mystery of D.B. Cooper's identity. They interviewed family members of suspects, checked alibis, and investigated potential connections between Cooper and known criminals. But every time they thought they were getting closer to the truth, the trail went cold. Then came another breakthrough, or at least what seemed like one. In 2011, a man named Dwayne Weber came forward, claiming to have had a connection to the hijacking. Weber's wife, in a 2007 interview, had mentioned that her husband had once confessed to being D.B. Cooper on his deathbed. The story sent shockwaves through the investigation community, and Fisher and Marsh took a hard look at Weber's background. He had served in the Army during the Vietnam War, and there were rumors that he had been a skilled skydiver. The problem was that Weber had no solid evidence to support his confession. Despite the dramatic claim, there was no physical evidence linking him to the hijacking, and investigators quickly dismissed him as a suspect. His story, like so many others, was a dead end. But once again, the case had gained new attention. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the case showed no signs of slowing down. Documentaries, books, and articles were being published, all filled with theories about who Cooper really was. Every few years, a new lead or suspect would surface, only to be dismissed by the FBI as irrelevant or unfounded. The investigation had become a circus, with armchair detectives and conspiracy theorists offering their own explanations and suspects. And through it all, the identity of D.B. Cooper remained a mystery. Fisher, now a veteran agent, couldn't help but feel the weight of the case on her shoulders. She had worked on it for nearly 2 decades, and yet the questions had only multiplied. Every lead, every clue seemed to lead nowhere. D.B. Cooper had managed to outsmart them all. But then, in 2016, the FBI made a controversial decision. After years of dead ends, the Bureau officially closed the case. They cited a lack of solid evidence, the passage of time, and the overwhelming number of false leads as reasons for their decision. The case was now officially closed, but the legend of D.B. Cooper would never die. "Do you think we'll ever know the truth?" Fisher asked Marsh one evening as they sat in the office looking over the case files. Marsh paused, considering the question carefully. "I don't know, Karen. The more we dig, the more elusive the answers become. But sometimes, maybe the mystery is what keeps it alive. Maybe that's the only answer we'll ever get." Fisher leaned back in her chair, the weight of the unsolved case pressing on her. "I just hope that one day we'll find something that ties it all together." Marsh nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe Cooper will just remain the one who got away." Years had passed since the FBI officially closed the case on D.B. Cooper, and the story of his audacious heist had become part of American folklore. Yet, despite the Bureau's decision to wrap up the investigation, the legend of Cooper persisted. The questions surrounding his identity, his escape, and whether he had truly survived his daring jump from the plane continued to captivate people. And as with any great mystery, new suspects continued to surface, each more intriguing than the last. Special Agent Karen Fisher had moved on to other cases, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the Cooper case was never truly finished. She'd seen countless leads come and go, but the desire to uncover the truth still gnawed at her. Every time a new theory emerged, Fisher found herself revisiting the case, reviewing old evidence and thinking about the one question that would never be answered. Who was D.B. Cooper? Fisher's mind wandered back to 2011 when the deathbed confession of Dwayne Weber had briefly reignited her interest. Weber had claimed in his final moments that he was D.B. Cooper. Fisher had pored over Weber's background. The man had served in the Army during the Vietnam War, and his wife, after his passing, had made the startling claim that Weber had confessed to being Cooper. There was a strange resonance to his confession, but as with all the other theories, there were no solid pieces of evidence to back it up. Still, the confession was too compelling to ignore. Fisher dug into Weber's life, tracing his every step. There was no doubt that Weber had a criminal history, and he was an experienced skydiver. He even had connections to the Pacific Northwest, the very region where Cooper had vanished. Weber's behavior had been erratic at times, and his wife's claim was compelling. Yet there were no concrete links, no parachutes, no money, no plane tickets that could definitively connect him to the crime. Once again, Fisher was left with more questions than answers. Dwayne Weber was just one of many suspects the FBI had considered over the years. Each one brought with them a unique set of characteristics that seemed to align with the mystery of Cooper's hijacking. One of the more persistent suspects was a man named Kenneth Christensen, a former employee of Northwest Orient Airlines. Christensen's name had surfaced in connection with the case after a journalist, Thomas Colbert, investigated the theory in the early 2000s. Christensen had worked for Northwest Orient Airlines during the time of the hijacking. He had also been an experienced skydiver. According to some of his colleagues, Christensen had displayed strange behavior shortly after the hijacking, such as a sudden interest in parachuting. In fact, after his death in 1994, a photo was discovered that seemed to show him with a parachute, adding to the suspicions. But when Fisher and Marsh went over the evidence related to Christensen, they found a critical flaw. The connection to Cooper was tenuous at best. Christensen had been a professional with experience in the airline industry, but nothing pointed directly to him as the hijacker. There were no witnesses who could definitively identify him, and no physical evidence linked him to the crime. Still, the idea that Cooper was someone familiar with the airline industry stuck with Fisher. It was clear that Cooper had inside knowledge of planes and their operations. The fact that he had requested a specific type of parachute and knew exactly how to deploy it spoke to a level of expertise that wasn't common knowledge. Whoever Cooper was, they had to have experience in aviation, or, at the very least, a background that involved detailed knowledge of flight operations. Another suspect who had been considered over the years was a man named Richard McCoy, a former military man and skydiving enthusiast. McCoy had hijacked a plane in 1972, just a year after Cooper's crime, using a remarkably similar modus operandi. Like Cooper, McCoy demanded a ransom and then parachuted out of the plane. The case bore striking similarities to Cooper's hijacking, and many believed that McCoy could have been Cooper, or at the very least, could have been inspired by him. Fisher and Marsh took a closer look at McCoy, but the theory quickly fell apart. Although McCoy had pulled off a similar hijacking, he had been caught shortly afterward, making it unlikely that he was the elusive D.B. Cooper. Furthermore, McCoy's motivations seemed different from Cooper's. While McCoy was caught and imprisoned, Cooper had never been found. It was the perfect crime, one that McCoy simply couldn't replicate. As the years wore on, the FBI's focus on the case began to wane. The Bureau had closed the investigation, but the allure of the mystery remained. The media, once captivated by the manhunt, began to lose interest. But there was still a devoted following of amateur sleuths who insisted that Cooper's identity could be uncovered. In fact, some believed that Cooper was someone much closer to the investigation, a member of the FBI perhaps, or an airline employee with deep knowledge of the system. Fisher wasn't sure if any of these theories would ever hold water, but one thing was clear. D.B. Cooper had become a symbol of the one that got away. He was the ultimate criminal mastermind, the man who had defied the law and disappeared without a trace. His crime was so perfect that it had etched itself into the annals of history, and in the process had elevated the mystery of his identity to mythic proportions. Fisher knew that the key to solving the case might have been buried in the mountains of Washington state, or perhaps in some long-forgotten piece of evidence that had been overlooked. She also knew that someone, whether it was a former FBI agent, an aviation expert, or a former criminal, had to know the truth. But the problem was, they all had one thing in common. They had been elusive, just like Cooper himself. Despite the many theories and false leads, the FBI's decision to close the case in 2016 had marked a turning point. The investigation, now officially over, had been relegated to the archives, and the mystery of D.B. Cooper was left unresolved. But in a strange way, this only fueled the ongoing fascination with the case. Documentaries, books, and podcasts filled with speculative theories and unproven claims continued to surface, each one building upon the myth of D.B. Cooper. Every time the case was mentioned, the question remained, who was D.B. Cooper? Fisher stood alone in her office late one evening, staring at the board filled with old photographs, timelines, and scribbled theories. She had poured years of her life into solving this case, only to be left with more questions than when she had started. And yet, the story of D.B. Cooper was far from over. It had become a part of American history, a symbol of mystery, defiance, and the ultimate crime. Perhaps Cooper had been someone who had simply vanished into thin air, like a shadow slipping through the cracks. Or maybe, just maybe, someone somewhere knew the truth, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. For Fisher, the mystery would never truly be closed. Cooper's disappearance had become the ultimate game of cat and mouse, and one day, perhaps, the truth would finally come to light. Even after the official closure of the D.B. Cooper case in 2016, the legend continued to grow. The man who had pulled off the perfect heist, a hijacking so bold and calculated that even decades later it remained unsolved, had embedded himself into American lore. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a symbol of the ultimate escape artist, a ghost who had managed to elude the law in the most spectacular way imaginable. Special Agent Karen Fisher, now far removed from the case she had spent years working on, often found herself reflecting on Cooper's legacy. In the quiet moments when the weight of other investigations lifted and her mind was free to wander, she would think about the strange satisfaction Cooper must have felt as he jumped from that plane, disappearing into the night. The FBI may have closed the case, but Cooper's myth was only expanding. The disappearance had become the stuff of legend. Stories about him circulated in bars, on podcasts, and on true crime shows. A whole subculture of amateur sleuths emerged, their theories growing wilder with each passing year. Online forums were dedicated to discussing the case, with some contributors convinced they had solved it, while others offered up increasingly bizarre suspects. To the public, D.B. Cooper was a man who could not be pinned down, a mystery that simply refused to be solved. Fisher, while no longer actively working on the case, still occasionally checked in on the latest developments. The latest theory, of course, was that Cooper had not died during his escape, but instead had continued to live quietly among the public, a man who would always remain one step ahead of the law. And why not? The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like something Cooper, with his methodical approach to everything, would do. Could it be possible that he was living in plain sight, surrounded by people who would never suspect a thing? It wasn't just the public that continued to be fascinated by D.B. Cooper's disappearance. The media, which had once been on the front lines of the case, never fully let go. Documentaries were made, books were written, and every anniversary of the hijacking, news outlets would revisit the case, highlighting the mystery of the man who had stolen $200,000 and jumped out of a plane, never to be heard from again. The most recent book on the subject, The Cooper Conspiracy, had shot to the top of bestseller lists, recounting the investigation from the early days to the eventual closing of the case. The author, Thomas Colbert, had dedicated his career to solving the mystery. His book posited that the true identity of Cooper was likely someone who had been involved with the airline industry, perhaps even an employee of Northwest Orient Airlines. His theories were compelling, and Colbert had garnered a considerable following. But, like all theories before, it was ultimately speculative, and no evidence ever came forward to conclusively prove any of the claims. For Fisher, this continuous cycle of new theories and books was a reminder of how some mysteries refused to die, even when the facts ran dry. Cooper was an enigma, and people loved to be captivated by enigmas. In 2020, a documentary series titled Who Was D.B. Cooper was released, attracting millions of viewers. The show dove deep into the mystery, exploring every possible theory, from the most rational to the outlandish. For 6 episodes, viewers were treated to interviews with experts, investigators, and even self-proclaimed Cooper experts who swore they knew the true identity of the skyjacker. The series ended without an answer, true to the legacy of the case. It was a strange feeling for Fisher to watch. She had been part of the investigation for so many years, and yet here she was, watching the case unfold on television, just like everyone else. She couldn't help but wonder what Cooper himself would have thought of it all. Would he have enjoyed the attention? Or would he have found it a bit too much? Perhaps, if he was still alive, he was watching the endless parade of documentaries, interviews, and books, and shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of it all. But there was something about the mystery that kept people coming back. It wasn't just the money or the daring escape, it was the idea that someone could vanish without a trace, outsmarting the FBI and slipping through their fingers. It was the perfect crime. In 2022, a breakthrough came, or so it seemed. A new lead, found during a routine review of old evidence, suggested a connection between Cooper and a man named Dan Cooper, a Canadian pilot who had worked with a commercial airline in the years leading up to the hijacking. The name was strikingly similar, and several of Cooper's known characteristics seemed to align with the profile of Dan Cooper. But the lead, much like all the others, faded into nothingness after a short investigation. Cooper's true identity was like a mirage. Every time someone got close, it vanished before they could touch it. Fisher wasn't surprised. It seemed fitting. In the years since the hijacking, she had grown accustomed to the idea that the case might never be solved. There were always new suspects, new theories, and new leads, but they never seemed to lead anywhere. For all the attention it garnered, Cooper had left behind no real clues, no fingerprints, no DNA, just a trail of mystery that was impossible to follow. And so, the myth of D.B. Cooper endured. As time passed, the questions about Cooper's fate only grew more elusive. Did he survive the jump? Was he hiding in plain sight, living a quiet life? Had he used the money to disappear, or had he spent it all in the years after the heist? No one could say for sure. The theories continued to multiply, each one adding layers to the myth, but none of them could offer a definitive answer. Fisher, now well into her career, had learned to accept that some cases simply never had an answer. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, leaving behind only a trail of speculation and wonder. As for Cooper, whether he had survived or not, whether he had continued to live as a ghost or had died in the wilderness, one thing was certain. His legacy would live on for as long as people were willing to entertain the idea of the man who had outsmarted the law and disappeared without a trace. In the end, D.B. Cooper wasn't just a criminal. He was an idea, a symbol of the impossible, the perfect heist, and the unrelenting pursuit of answers that may never come, and that, perhaps, was the greatest mystery of all. The mystery of D.B. Cooper's fate continued to haunt investigators and the public alike. With every new theory that emerged and each passing year, the question of whether Cooper survived his daring escape or whether he perished in the unforgiving wilderness remained a tantalizing puzzle. Special Agent Karen Fisher had dedicated years to uncovering the truth, and yet, as she looked back over the case, she had to admit that the answers were as elusive as ever. She had investigated leads, interviewed suspects, and followed every available thread. But in the end, it felt as though Cooper had somehow anticipated every move the FBI would make. The evidence pointed to one thing. D.B. Cooper was a master of the perfect heist, and no one would ever know for certain what had happened to him. Fisher often found herself pondering the strange satisfaction Cooper must have felt when he jumped from that plane. No one was expecting him to survive. The odds were stacked against him. The night was cold and the terrain was rough. But Cooper had done it. He had evaded capture, outsmarted the FBI, and disappeared. It was as if he had become a ghost, slipping through the cracks of history. As the years passed, the case became less about finding the truth and more about the mystery itself. The public's obsession with Cooper grew, with new books, documentaries, and theories emerging at regular intervals. Each new theory seemed to bring a fresh wave of excitement, but no one could piece together the final answer. One of the most enduring questions was whether Cooper had survived the jump. Theories varied. Some believed that Cooper had died in the wilderness, his body lost to time. Others believed he had somehow managed to escape the authorities and lived out the rest of his life under an assumed identity, enjoying the fortune he had stolen. But the reality was that no one would ever know for sure. The evidence was just too thin. In 2023, a breakthrough came, but it was not the definitive answer everyone had hoped for. An amateur investigator named Robert McKinnon, a retired journalist and self-proclaimed expert on the case, claimed to have uncovered new evidence that tied a former military man named Jack Cunningham to the crime. McKinnon's theory was based on years of research, and although it seemed plausible, there were no solid connections, no physical evidence that could confirm Cunningham's involvement. The discovery reignited the fire of speculation, but it ultimately added to the ever-growing pile of theories that had already proven inconclusive. The mystery of D.B. Cooper was like an insurmountable mountain. Every time it seemed like a breakthrough was within reach, it crumbled away, leaving investigators and armchair sleuths back at square one. Fisher had long since moved on to other cases, but she still occasionally checked in on the Cooper mystery. It was an itch that wouldn't go away, a story that had become larger than life, growing in stature with each passing year. The case, now decades old, remained an enigma. It wasn't just a criminal act anymore, it was a symbol of defiance, of the impossible. Cooper had accomplished what most criminals only dream about, pulling off the perfect crime and then vanishing without a trace. Whether he was dead or alive, the legacy of D.B. Cooper lived on, perpetuated by the mystery that still surrounded his disappearance. Perhaps the greatest lesson that could be taken from the D.B. Cooper case was this: sometimes the most captivating stories are the ones that remain unsolved. Cooper had become a legend not because of the crime he committed, but because of his ability to slip through the cracks of history, leaving nothing behind but questions and intrigue. In the end, D.B. Cooper's true identity would remain a secret forever. As we reach the conclusion of this story, we're reminded that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. D.B. Cooper's audacity, his precise execution of the heist, and his ability to evade capture have cemented him as a legend in American crime history. His fate, whether he lived or died, may never be fully understood, and that's what makes his story so enduring. But no matter how many years pass, no matter how many theories emerge, one thing is clear: Cooper will always be remembered as the man who got away. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dark side of crime. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Beneath the Surface, the Dark Side of Crime. We'll keep exploring the mysteries that have shaped our world, and we hope you'll join us for the next one. And that's it for today's episode of Beneath the Surface, the Dark Side of Crime. If this story has left you questioning everything you thought you knew, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your thoughts are important to us. What do you think really happened to D.B. Cooper? Do you believe the truth is out there? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows with us, and remember, sometimes the darkest stories are the ones that are never fully revealed.